There is a page Mary Ingalls could read that you cannot. Not because the page is lost, not because the language is foreign. The page exists. The language was English. The dots are still pressed into the paper, exactly where they were pressed more than 140 years ago in a school in Vinton, Iowa, by a teacher whose name America has forgotten, for a girl whose name America remembers wrong. You cannot read it. Almost no one alive can. The code under Mary Ingalls' fingers was not Braille. It was a different system, a competing system, a system that fought Braille for the future of blind literacy in the United States, and lost. And when it lost, the country did not just stop teaching it. The country stopped remembering it had ever existed. A girl who lost her sight learned to read again through a code that the country later lost sight of. The first wound is there. It is not the deepest one. The deepest one is the cost. Because before there was a code, there was a price. Before there was a school, there was a family that could not afford to send her. Before there was a famous blind sister in a beloved American book, there was a 14-year-old girl sitting at a sewing table, working 12-hour days for 25 cents a day, so that her blind older sister might learn to read with her fingers. The girl at the sewing table was Laura Ingalls, the same Laura Ingalls who would, decades later, write the books that taught America what pioneer childhood was supposed to feel like. Laura wrote the books. Laura told the story. Laura is the reason Mary is remembered at all by millions of strangers. But before Laura was the voice of the Prairie, she was a child inside the expense. And the expense is the part the books made beautiful, because beauty is easier to carry than the price. Tonight, we're going to count the cost, not to ruin a childhood story, to grow it up. Because here is what the record actually shows. Mary Amelia Ingalls was born on the 10th of January 1865 in a cabin near Pepin, Wisconsin, on the same day her father Charles turned a year older. She was the first child. She was the steady daughter. She was the girl who, before she was 14, was already carrying the weight of a household that moved and moved and moved, chasing land that never quite held, wheat that never quite ripened, weather that never quite broke the family's way. Then, in 1879, an illness took her sight. The books called it scarlet fever. The family called it scarlet fever. The television show called it scarlet fever. Generations of readers grew up calling it scarlet fever. And then, in 2013, a team of researchers published a paper in the journal Pediatrics, and they said, it probably was not scarlet fever at all. The surviving evidence, they argued, fits a brain infection. Viral meningoencephalitis. Better than it fits the disease the country had been naming for 130 years. Even the cause of Mary's blindness was a story America told wrong for more than a century. If even that detail could be wrong, the most basic medical fact in the most famous blind girl story in American literature, then every layer under it has to be re-examined. The cost, the school, the code, the marriage the television show gave her, the teaching career the television show invented for her, the husband who never existed, the books that arrived 4 years after she was already in the ground, and the page, always the page Mary could read and the country cannot. So, this is not the cozy version. This is the receipt under the cozy version. The train tickets someone had to pay for, the tuition someone had to scrape together, the territorial government that had to be petitioned for help, the 12-hour sewing day that bought a single textbook, the code that won a place in the curriculum and then lost the war for the country's memory, the graduation that earned a degree the world had very little use for, the return home to a life that never opened into the future the education had promised, the death in 1928 in a room in Keystone, South Dakota of pneumonia following a stroke, 4 years before the first Little House book appeared and turned her into a character she would never meet. There are 3 Marys in this story. The girl her family loved, the character millions of readers think they know, the woman in the record, disciplined enough to graduate at the top of her class, skilled enough to read a code that no longer exists, quiet enough in public memory that other people kept explaining her after she was gone. The old story says Mary went blind and learned courage. The evidence says something colder. A girl lost ordinary print. A younger sister worked for coins. A family and a territory together carried the cost. A school trained her hands. A disputed medical story hardened into public memory. A television show gave her a husband she never had. And a code under her fingers disappeared from almost everyone else's understanding. So, if you came here for a hidden Little House story, the hidden thing is not one scandal. It is the price tag. It is the page. It is the code. It is the fact that Mary Ingalls learned to read the world again, and the world never learned to read her back. We start where the story usually ends, with the blind girl coming home, with the page she could read, with the silence the country filled in for her after she was no longer there to fill it in herself. Mary Amelia Ingalls was born on the 10th of January 1865 in a one-room cabin near Pepin, Wisconsin. In the big woods her sister would later turn into the opening sentence of an American childhood. The date is doing more work than it looks like. It was also her father's birthday. Charles Ingalls, Pa in the books, the man with the fiddle and the restlessness and the wagon, turned 29 the day his first child was born. Father and daughter, sharing a date, in the same winter house, in the same county the family would leave and return to and leave again, because staying anywhere was the thing Charles Ingalls could never quite learn to do. The books turned that coincidence into something close to providence, a first child arriving on a father's birthday, the kind of fact a family keeps because it sounds arranged, the kind of fact that, later, when the family has become a national memory, starts to feel like the start of a story that was always heading somewhere. But Mary was not the start of a story. She was a baby. She was the first person Caroline and Charles Ingalls had to keep alive. She was the child they learned parenthood on, the one who taught them, before any book did, what it took to feed a small mouth through a Wisconsin winter, what it meant to carry a daughter across a territory in a wagon, what it meant to be responsible for the first time for a life that could not yet walk or speak or refuse. Mary came first, Laura came later. The order matters more than the books let on. Because the story most Americans know is Laura's story. Laura runs, Laura watches, Laura wants, Laura disobeys. Laura sees the prairie, the slough, the railroad camp, the long winter, the town, the schoolhouse, the young man driving the horses down the main street of Smet. Laura is the camera. Laura is the voice. Laura is the eye through which a country learned to picture what pioneer childhood felt like. Mary, in the books, often stands on the other side of that energy. She's quieter, she's better behaved, she's more dutiful, more still, more easily rewarded for being good. The contrast works beautifully on the page. Laura is restless, Mary is steady. Laura burns, Mary glows. Laura is the engine, Mary is the lamp. But real families are not built to serve literary contrast. A real older sister does not exist so the younger sister can have a sharper personality. A real first daughter does not become steady because the writer needs a foil. She becomes steady because someone in the household had to be, and the lot fell to her, and she did not get to refuse. Before she was the blind sister, Mary was the first child, the child Caroline and Charles practiced on. The girl expected to help with the younger ones, to model order, to be the one who sat still when sitting still was asked of her, to be the one whose good behaviour made the parents believe, briefly, that they were doing this right. She was not born as a symbol. She became one only after the books made the family legible to strangers. The first fracture is here. The books needed Mary to be remembered. They also needed Laura to remain the centre. So Mary's life appears with tenderness, but not with full weight. She matters most when Laura is changed by her. When Laura must work for her, when Laura must read to her, when Laura must become Mary's eyes. Mary's function in the books is in part to make Laura's growth visible. She is the cost Laura pays. She's the responsibility Laura learns. She's the reason Laura's childhood stops being only childhood and starts to look like duty. The emotional truth of that is real. The frame is narrow. What gets lost inside the frame is the cost of being Mary herself. To understand that cost, the story has to slow down before the blindness. Mary was not a girl waiting for tragedy to give her a role. She was educated as much as the family could manage, in the broken, interrupted way a moving household could manage anything. She loved learning. She had the kind of mind the later school record would recognise quickly, a mind that arrived at Vinton already hungry, already accustomed to doing more with less, already trained by the small privations of a household that never had quite enough of anything except children and weather. When she reached Vinton, her academic performance would be high enough to be remembered. Her music would be above average. Her conduct would be marked at the highest possible grade. None of that sounds like a decorative sister. It sounds like a serious mind trapped inside a family that could barely keep its own floor from moving. The Ingalls family moved again and again. The books make those moves feel like episodes in a national romance. A wagon rolls, a fiddle plays, a house rises from grass. The family begins again. But for a child, beginning again is not always adventure. Sometimes it is loss. Sometimes it is another school interrupted, another set of neighbours left behind, another winter learned from scratch, another field that may or may not feed the table, another year of being the new girl in a classroom that will not stay long enough to call her own. Mary was the child who had to be good through all of that. The detail is easy to miss. Good children disappear first. The loud child becomes the story. The difficult child becomes the memory. The steady child becomes useful. She helps. She waits. She absorbs the household's pressure until the pressure begins to look like personality. People look at her and say, "She is so calm." They do not say, "She has had to be." This is the trap the books could not fully escape, because the books needed Mary to be calm. Laura's story required a sister who obeyed, who modelled goodness, who made Laura's small rebellions visible by contrast. The book Mary had to be the still point so the book Laura could move. The real Mary was a girl, with a girl's interior, carrying the weight of being the one who stayed good while the household moved and the wheat failed and the bills came and the younger siblings kept arriving. She was not a saint in training. She was a child under pressure. The pressure shaped her. The books kept the shape and dropped the pressure. We are about to spend 2 hours with that pressure. We are going to follow the record, the dates, the names, the curriculum list, the quarter, the train ticket, the school's bells, the commencement essay, the fly nets, the stroke in Keystone, the pneumonia, the grave into Smet, the first Little House book, 4 years too late. We are going to count what Mary cost, and we are going to notice the whole way who paid, because the books made the cost beautiful, and beauty, in this story, is what hid the receipt. The public story has a familiar answer for what happened to Mary: scarlet fever. For generations, that explanation felt settled. Mary went blind after a bout of scarlet fever. Readers repeated it, viewers repeated it. The television version, with its soft lamplight and its closed curtains and its mother listening for breath in a back bedroom, helped make the explanation feel permanent. Scarlet fever had the sound of old childhood danger. It belonged to the world of wash basins, quilts, fevers that rose in the night, mothers walking the floor with a sick child in their arms. It felt like the kind of thing that happened in a book, so it stayed in the book. But the medical story is not simple, and America has been telling itself the wrong one for more than 130 years. In 2013, a paper appeared in the journal Pediatrics. Its authors, a team that included a pediatrician, a medical historian, and researchers who had gone back through the surviving letters, newspaper references, school records, and family accounts, argued that scarlet fever probably was not the best explanation for what took Mary's sight. The available evidence, they wrote, fit better with an illness involving the brain and the membranes around it. In the language of the time, people called it brain fever. In the language of modern medicine, it is closer to viral meningoencephalitis. Read that word slowly. Meningoencephalitis. An inflammation of the brain and the tissues around it. A swelling inside the skull that, in a teenager in 1879, on a homestead miles from any doctor with any tool worth having, could take sight and leave the rest of the body alive. The researchers were careful. They did not pretend certainty. They said the surviving record does not give us a modern hospital chart with every symptom neatly listed. They said we get fragments, we get family memory, we get old medical language that covered more than one possible illness. We get later experts trying to reconstruct what happened from the evidence that survived. They said the traditional scarlet fever explanation has been seriously challenged, and another diagnosis better fits the evidence. The careful line is also a damning one. Because if the illness was different, then the public memory has been repeating not only an old family explanation, but possibly the wrong medical story, for 130 years, in a children's book read by tens of millions of people, in a television show watched by tens of millions more, in every listicle, every biography, every school report, every casual reference to the blind sister and the Little House books. America had the wrong name for what happened to Mary Ingalls. The first thing to get out of the way: Laura did not lie. Laura is not the villain of this story, and we should not let her become one. People repeat the names they inherit. They write within the knowledge available to them. They compress pain into story because pain without shape is heavy to carry. Laura was a child when her sister went blind. She was a young woman when she began writing about it. She was an old woman when the books were published. She used the explanation the family had. The family used the explanation the doctor, or the neighbour, or the memory, or the conventional language of the time had given them. Scarlet fever was the name a 19th century household reached for when a child took sick with a fever and a rash and did not recover. It was the name on the shelf. They pulled it down. They used it. The book kept it. The country kept the book. The point is not deception. The point is that the clean version is the problem, because the clean version says scarlet fever, blindness, courage, sweetness. A familiar childhood illness, a familiar tragedy, a familiar lesson about endurance. Everything fits. The reader closes the book feeling that the world, even when it is cruel, is at least legible. Illnesses have names, names have shapes, shapes have endings. Mary went blind, Mary endured, Mary went to a school. The story resolves. The record says disputed illness, family labour, public support, strict school, tactile literacy, limited adult life, posthumous fame, and a woman whose full voice never became public. A different story. And it begins with the humility to admit that the first answer may not have been the final one. The implications get larger. If the cause of Mary's blindness could be simplified by memory, if the most basic medical fact in the most famous blind girl story in American literature could be wrong for more than a century, then every later layer has to be handled carefully. The cost, the school, the code, the return home, the television marriage that never belonged to the real woman. Each layer asks the same question. What did the public version make easier to hold? And what did that ease cost Mary? Memory hardens around a label. A family may use the words it has. A children's book may inherit those words. A television episode may turn them into an image. Then millions of people may carry that image as fact, because it arrived inside a story they trusted. The image travels. The image outlives the evidence. The image becomes the evidence in the minds of readers, because the readers cannot be expected to go back to the original record every time they remember a beloved character. The illness matters beyond medicine. It is the first place where the public version and the record part company. It will not be the last. But Mary's body carried the cost before any explanation became literature. She lost her sight. She was 14 years old. She had been a girl who learned easily, who liked school, who helped with the younger ones, who sat still when sitting still was asked of her. And then, in the space of weeks, the record does not let us count them exactly, the world went dark. The printed page went dark. The face of her mother went dark. The face of her sister went dark. The face of her father on his shared birthday went dark. The window, the slough, the grass, the horses, the wagon, the plates on the table, the hands of the people who loved her. All of it gone. The house changed. Laura read aloud to her. The act has often been remembered as sweetness, and part of it was. A younger sister reading to an older sister is tender. But tenderness can become labour when it happens every day because the world has removed a person's access to print. Laura did not simply entertain Mary. Laura became a bridge. Every printed word had to pass through a sighted mouth before Mary could receive it. A book was no longer an object Mary could privately open. It became a performance someone else had to give her. Education became dependent on somebody else's time, somebody else's patience, somebody else's voice. Blindness cost first, privacy, speed, independence, the right to read a sentence without asking another person to lend you their eyes. And Mary was not a child without hunger for learning. The wound gets sharper here. A girl who did not care about books might have fared differently. Mary cared. The record later shows that school came easily to her. She had a mind that wanted more than pity. She had a mind that, in a different body or a different century, might have filled a library. But wanting more did not pay tuition. Wanting more did not build a blind school in Dakota Territory. Wanting more did not put raised dot books in her hands. The family needed a place that could teach Mary to live without sight, and the nearest real answer was not in Smet. It was in Vinton, Iowa, at the Iowa College for the Blind. That meant distance. It meant money. It meant a train. It meant taking a daughter whose world had already gone dark and sending her away from the family that had become her only map. The public story often makes that decision feel noble because we know the outcome before the scene begins. We know Mary goes. We know she studies. We know she comes home educated. We can afford to admire the sacrifice because we are safe on the far side of it. The family was not. They were standing before the cost. And the cost is where this story stops being sentimental. The number was 25 cents, a small number. Small numbers in this story are crueler than large ones. A large number announces a crisis. A small number can hide inside a family anecdote until nobody feels the weight anymore. The number was 25 cents, not a symbol, a wage. Laura Ingalls helped base shirts for 25 cents for a 12-hour workday, and the money went toward Mary's schooling. The kind of detail a family story can turn soft if it is placed inside the wrong light. A little sister working for her blind older sister, a child earning coins, a household pulling together. The books, when they came, knew exactly how to frame it. Pioneer pluck, sisterly love, the American ethic of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, even when the boots are too big for you and the straps are too short. But read the number again. 25 cents. 12 hours. A 12-hour day is not a childhood. A 12-hour day is a shift. A 12-hour day in 1879 or 1880 or 1881 in a town in Dakota Territory, at a sewing machine or a sewing table, basting shirts, a body sitting in one position for almost every hour of daylight the day has to offer, with a needle, with thread, with fabric, with the small repeated motion of the hands that, by the end of the day, has been repeated thousands of times, and at the end of that day the wage is 25 cents, a quarter, the price of a cup of coffee today, in a paper cup, the price of a third of a gallon of milk today at a corner store, the price of almost nothing today, the price in 1879 of a portion of what it would cost to send a blind girl to a school in Iowa for a year. The first thing the number does, it connects the smallest possible wage to the largest possible line item. A child's body for 12 hours buys a fraction of a textbook. A child's body for a week buys a fraction of a train ticket. A child's body for a month buys a fraction of a tuition payment that the family still cannot meet on its own. There is no need to improve that sentence. It already hurts. Picture the scene. A girl, Laura was 13, 14, 15 in the years this was happening, sits with fabric in her lap or pinned to a table. Her hands do work that does not belong to childhood. The work is repetitive. The work is small. The work does not announce itself. The work does not produce anything a stranger would stop to admire. The work produces shirts. The shirts go somewhere. The girl does not get to keep them. The girl gets to keep the quarter. Somewhere beyond that work is an older sister who cannot read ordinary print anymore. Somewhere beyond that sister is a school in another state that may give her back a kind of independence. Between the girl at the sewing and the girl at the school sits money. Not inspiration. Money. Where the story becomes adult. The family was not purchasing refinement. They were assembling survival. The Dakota Territorial Government helped, with public support allocated for Mary's tuition and books. Charles and Caroline carried what they could. Laura carried what a child could carry. Mary, when she was home, carried what a blind daughter in a sighted household could carry. Everyone turned toward one question. How do you give a blind daughter a future when the household is already pressed thin? The easy version says the family sacrificed because they were good. The harder version says they sacrificed because the alternative was frightening. If Mary stayed home without specialized education, she stayed dependent on whoever had time to read to her, guide her, teach her, and make room for her. A blind girl on the prairie could not simply wish herself into books, maps, music, letters, or paid skill. Wanting did not raise dots on paper. Wanting did not teach fingers to read. Wanting did not hire a teacher, or build a dormitory, or print a textbook in raised characters, or pay the railroad to carry a teenage girl 400 miles east to a town in Iowa she had never seen. The school could. The quarter matters for this reason. It was not a cute pioneer detail. It was the first visible price of Mary's second education. The education she would receive after the printed page had left her. The education that was supposed to give her back a private life of the mind. The education that was supposed to make her less dependent on the family that loved her. Because love, in this household, was no longer enough to do the job. And it changes the way Laura's later story feels. Laura would become the famous observer, the eyes through which millions saw the prairie. But before she became the voice, she was a child inside the expense. She was working so the older sister, the one who had lost ordinary print, might learn another way to reach language. The books Laura wrote later, the books that made her one of the most read children's authors in American history, were built on top of those 12-hour days. The voice America fell in love with was a voice trained in part at a sewing table for a quarter a day, so a blind sister could learn to read. The books tell a story about a spunky girl in braids who hated sewing and loved running. The record tells a story about a girl whose hands were already doing women's work in long shifts, for a wage that was not a wage but a contribution to a sister's future. The book Laura complains about sewing. The record Laura sewed. The first emotional trap is here. At first, the subject seems to be blindness. Then the cost appears. At first, the cost seems to be only money. Then the code appears. At first, the code seems to be only a school subject. Then history changes the code. By the time the page is opened, the story is no longer about a blind girl enduring. It is about the price of access. It is about what families pay when a society has not yet made access ordinary. 25 cents is where the sentimental version starts to crack. Because love is easy to praise after the cost has been hidden. The books hide the cost inside the love. They make the sewing sound charming. They make the wages sound incidental. They make the family sound like it was pulling together out of pure goodness, rather than out of a terror of what would happen if they did not. They take a 12-hour day and turn it into a paragraph. They take a quarter and turn it into a metaphor. They take a child's labour and turn it into a lesson about sisterhood. Count the cost. The love becomes heavier. The family becomes more real. Mary becomes more expensive. Laura becomes less of a character and more of a person. The whole shape of the Little House story shifts very slightly in the direction of the truth. And the truth is that the Ingalls family was poor. Not the picturesque poor of pioneer romance. Not the kind of poor where the cupboard is bare but the fiddle plays and the snow falls and the family is warm in each other's company. The actual poor. The kind of poor where a doctor is too expensive to call. The kind of poor where a winter's wheat can fail and the family eats bread made from wheat that was not quite fit for bread. The kind of poor where a blind daughter's education requires a territorial appropriation, a sister's wages, a father's pride being set aside to ask for help, a mother's quiet management of a household budget that has no margin in it. The household Mary grew up in, the household that produced the quarter, the household that would, in 1881, put a 14-year-old girl on a train to Iowa and hope the school on the other end of the line could give her back something the illness had taken. The train ticket was the next expense. The tuition was the one after that. The textbooks were the one after that. The years of separation, a daughter 400 miles from her mother, 400 miles from the sister who had sewed for her, 400 miles from the father whose birthday she shared, were the one after that. Every layer of Mary's education was a layer of cost, and every layer of cost was carried in some proportion by people whose names the country does not remember the way it remembers Laura's. The territorial legislators who voted the appropriation, the neighbours who contributed, the teachers in Vinton who worked for salaries that, in many cases, were not large, the cooks and matrons and groundskeepers who kept the school running, the railroad workers who took Mary's ticket and pointed her to the right car, the strangers in Iowa who housed her on layovers, the other blind students in the dormitory whose families had scraped together their own versions of the same quarter. The whole infrastructure of 19th century disability education, which existed because America had begun, slowly and unevenly, to accept that blind people had a right to learn, but which existed on a budget and on a clock and on the labour of people who were not paid much, and on the patience of families who had to send their children away in order to give them a chance. The system the quarter bought into, the system the books made beautiful by leaving most of it out. The school is coming. The town is Vinton. The year is 1881. The girl is 14, going on 15, blind for 2 years, about to enter a building she has never seen, in a state she has never visited, to learn a code she has never heard of, from teachers whose names her sister will later compress into a single sentence about a school that helped. The school did help. The school also took. The school gave Mary back a private life of the mind. The school also took her away from the family whose labour had paid for her to be there. Both things are true. Easy sentiment fails here. If Vinton becomes only salvation, the separation disappears. If Vinton becomes only institutional coldness, Mary's achievement disappears. The record gives the harder truth. Vinton gave Mary tools her family could not give her. The price of those tools was distance from the people whose sacrifice had sent her there. The train is leaving the station. The quarter is in Laura's pocket. Mary is on board. A 14-year-old girl, blind for 2 years, boards a train in Dakota Territory in the autumn of 1881, heading east. She has never been on a train this far before. She has never been to Iowa. She has never been inside a school designed for people like her because there has never been a school designed for people like her anywhere near her. She's travelling alone, or as alone as a teenage girl could travel in 1881, with a ticket her family has scraped together and a trunk packed by a mother who is not on the platform and will not be at the other end. The station, a wooden platform, a telegraph wire, a clock, a whistle in the distance, a girl standing between her parents, Charles, whose restlessness has shaped every mile of her childhood, and Carolyn, whose steadiness has held the household together through every one of those miles. Mary cannot see the train, she hears it. She hears the hiss of the steam, the clatter of the trucks on the rail, the conductor's call. She smells the coal smoke and the hot iron and the oil on the moving parts. She feels the platform vibrate under her shoes, the moment the cost becomes physical. Everything before this, the illness, the blindness, the year of Laura reading aloud, the 12-hour days at the sewing, the letters to the territorial government, the appropriations, the conversations late at night between Charles and Carolyn about whether they could really do this. All of it has been preparation for this platform. The preparation is over. The train is here. Mary has to get on it. The books, when they came, knew how to handle this moment. They softened it. They made the departure feel like the beginning of an adventure. They let the reader imagine Mary arriving at Vinton as a girl stepping into a story. And in a sense she was. But the story she was stepping into was not the one the books would later tell. It was the story of a girl whose family had paid, in labour and money and distance, to send her to a place that could teach her to live in the dark. And the price of that teaching was that she would not see her family again for 9 months. 9 months. A school year. An eternity in the life of a teenage girl who has spent the last 2 years inside a small house with the same 4 walls and the same voices. Mary had become, in those 2 years, almost a fixture of the Smet house. The blind daughter, the one who sat in the chair by the window, the one Laura read to, the one Carrie and Grace grew up around, the one Caroline kept an eye on without ever saying so, the one Charles played the fiddle for in the evening, because the fiddle was the one thing in the house that did not need sight to be enjoyed. Now she was leaving. The chair would be empty. The book Laura had been reading aloud would sit on the shelf half finished until Mary came home for the summer. The fiddle would play to a room that no longer contained the daughter it had been played for. The quarter bought this, not just tuition, not just books, not just a seat in a classroom in Vinton. The quarter bought distance, it bought absence. It bought the long months during which the family would have to imagine what Mary was doing 400 miles away, in a building none of them had ever seen, with teachers none of them had ever met, learning a code none of them had ever heard named. The train moves. The platform falls behind. Charles and Caroline stand and watch the cars shrink, and then they turn and walk home to a house that is, for the first time in 15 years, missing its first daughter. Mary is on the train. She cannot see the Prairie going past. She feels it. The swaying of the car, the rhythm of the rails, the stops at small towns where voices call out names she does not know. She is in the company of strangers. Some of them, perhaps, are kind. Some of them, perhaps, are not. She cannot read their faces. She can only hear their voices, smell their clothes, feel the seat beside her shift when someone sits down or stands up. The courage that took, not the clean, inspirational courage the books would later describe. The actual courage. The courage of a teenage girl in a body that has recently failed her in the most fundamental way a body can fail a person. Getting on a train alone, going to a place she has never been, to learn a thing she's never heard of from people she has never met, in a state where she knows no one. The courage of deciding at 14 that the alternative, staying home, dependent, reading only what Laura had time to read to her, going only where someone could guide her, was worse than the train. The alternative was worse than the train. The family looked at the choice. Keep their blind daughter at home, in the household, where they could love her and care for her and watch her slowly narrow. Or send her away, to a school 400 miles east, where she might learn to read again, to play music, to make things with her hands, to move through a world that had been designed for people like her. They looked at the choice. They chose the train. They chose it because they loved her. They chose it because love, in this household, had run up against the edge of what love could do. Love could not emboss a page. Love could not build a school. Love could not turn darkness into letters under the fingers. Only infrastructure could do that. Only a building with teachers and dormitories and a curriculum and a printing press and a piano and a workshop and a bell to mark the hours could do that. And the nearest such building was in Vinton, Iowa. So Mary rode the train. She arrived in the late autumn of 1881 at a town she had never seen, in a state she had never visited, and was met. The record does not tell us by whom exactly, but we can imagine. By someone from the school, a matron perhaps, a teacher, an older student, someone who took her hand, or her arm, or her trunk, and walked her through streets she could not see, to a building she could not see, into a room she could not see, and said, in words she could hear, "This is where you will live now." She enrolled on the 23rd of November, 1881. The record preserves the date, the Iowa College for the Blind, in Vinton, Iowa. Mary Amelia Ingalls of Smet, Dakota Territory. 16 years old, she had turned 16 in January of that year, blind for 2 years, about to spend the next 7 years of her life with one interruption we'll come to, inside the walls of that institution. The institution is coming. The system, the curriculum, the bells, the code. The code is the thing the country forgot. We're about to walk into the room where Mary learned it. But before we do, stand for one more moment on the platform in Smet in the autumn of 1881 with Charles and Caroline after the train has gone. The platform is empty. The trunk is gone. The daughter is gone. The daughter will come back in the spring with skills and stories and a new way of moving through the world. But she will also come back changed. She will come back as a girl who has lived for 9 months in a place her family could not picture, among people her family could not name, learning a thing her family could not read. The gap between the family that paid for the school and the school that received the daughter is the next wound in this story. Mary's education was not just an education, it was a separation, and the separation had a cost that the tuition receipts do not record. The expense did not stop at the train ticket. It was the train ticket and the tuition and the textbooks and the dormitory and the years. It was the family standing on the platform. It was the empty chair by the window. It was the fiddle playing to a room that no longer contained the daughter it had been played for. Vinton is coming. The code is in there. The bells are in there. The whole apparatus of a 19th century institution for blind students, designed to train them out of dependence and into usefulness, is in there. The Iowa College for the Blind did not exist to comfort Mary Ingalls. It existed to train her. The difference matters because modern memory often softens institutions once they sit far enough in the past. We imagine red brick, falling snow, earnest teachers, a girl at a piano, a moral lesson about courage. Some of that may be near the truth. But the school Mary entered was also strict, scheduled, competitive, and practical. It had bells to divide the day. It had examinations. It had grades. It had industrial work. It had rules about silence. It had a curriculum that expected blind students to learn, perform, and produce. Mary did not enter a pity room. She entered a system. When she arrived in Vinton in November of 1881, the school had been operating for more than a decade under its state charter. It occupied a large building on the south side of town with dormitories, classrooms, a music room, workshops, a chapel, a dining hall, and an administration that took itself seriously. The students were blind, or partially sighted, or had conditions that the school's admission process judged to be appropriate for its program. They came from all over Iowa, and in Mary's case, from outside it. The Dakota Territory, in those years, did not yet have its own institution for blind students, and the territorial government had arranged for Mary to attend Iowa's. Mary was a Dakota student in an Iowa school. She was, in a bureaucratic sense, a guest. Her tuition was being paid in part by a territorial appropriation. Her books were being paid for, in part by the same appropriation. The family was paying the rest, with the help of Laura's sewing and whatever else they could scrape together. Mary knew, or could not avoid knowing, that her presence at the school was a transaction. The school had not invited her out of charity. The school had admitted her because someone was paying. That knowledge shapes a student. Mary was not a girl being given a gift. She was a girl whose family had bought her a chance, and who understood at 16 that the chance had to pay off. She could not afford to fail, not because the school would punish her, though it might, but because the family could not afford to send her again if she did. The school's curriculum in those years still used layered categories rather than the ordinary numbered grades that would come later. Students were enrolled in academic subjects, music courses, and industrial courses. The list, when you read it now, is striking, because it refuses to treat blind students as minds with only one need. They studied spelling, arithmetic, grammar, history, geography, physiology, philosophy, algebra, rhetoric, chemistry, zoology, civil government, political economy, geometry, botany, literature, raised print, and New York Point. Read that list again, slowly. Spelling, arithmetic, grammar, history, geography, physiology, philosophy, algebra, rhetoric, chemistry, zoology, civil government, political economy, geometry, botany, literature, raised print, New York Point. Not the curriculum of a school that believed blind students should be taught enough to braid rugs and sent home. The curriculum of a school that believed blind students could learn the same things sighted students learned, and learn them at the same level, with the addition of the specialized tactile and industrial skills their condition required. The school, in its ambition for its students, was ahead of much of the country. The country, in its expectation for blind people, would lag behind the school for a long time. New York Point, not a decoration, a course. The name sits inside the curriculum list like a key left in a drawer. If you do not know what it is, you pass over it. If you know, the story changes. We will spend a whole chapter on the code. For now, hold the fact of it. Mary's school curriculum named it. Her school taught it. Her school printed textbooks in it. Her school graded students on their ability to read and write it. It was not an elective. It was not an experimental track. It was a core subject, alongside algebra and rhetoric and chemistry, in a curriculum that took itself seriously. The code was the way Mary would read the world for the rest of her life. The day itself was built to remove drift. Rising bell, breakfast, chapel, academic class, another academic class, recess, more class, dinner, industrial work, music, physical training, recreation, supper, chapel again, reading, retiring, bells all day, silence at night. The kind of order a Prairie household could rarely maintain, because weather, work, sickness and money kept tearing holes in every plan. For Mary, that order may have been both strange and relieving. At home, blindness had made her dependent on the rhythms of sighted people. Laura's reading happened when Laura had time. Carolyn's guidance happened when Carolyn was in the room. Charles's help happened when Charles was not in the field. The household schedule was the schedule of a working farm, and a blind daughter's needs were folded into it where they could be. Mary's days in Smet had been shaped by other people's availability. At Vinton, blindness was the organising fact of the whole place. Everyone around her had been gathered because sight had failed them, or had never fully belonged to them. The school was not built around her exception. It was built around her condition. The bells rang for her. The classes were arranged for her. The textbooks were printed for her. The teachers were trained for her. The dormitory was designed for her. For the first time in 2 years, Mary was not the blind daughter in a sighted household. She was a student in a school. That can change a person, not because it removes grief, because it removes isolation. In Smet, Mary was the only blind person in her daily life. At Vinton, she was one of dozens. She ate with them. She studied with them. She slept in their dormitory. She heard their canes in the hallways. She heard their fingers on the raised dot pages in the reading room. She heard their mistakes in music class and their progress and their graduations. She was no longer alone inside her condition. But the school did not merely give. It demanded. Final examinations covered the year. Advancement depended on class standing. The rules made few allowances. The industrial courses were not decorative crafts meant to pass time. Students learned trades and skills that might help them contribute to household income, or support themselves in some limited way. Boys and girls learned different kinds of work. Girls took sewing, knitting, beadwork, and other hand skills. Mary later made fly nets for horses, work that helped supplement the family income after her father died. The school did not save Mary into leisure. It trained her into usefulness, the hard edge of 19th century disability education. The goal was not only dignity, it was productivity. A blind person had to become less dependent, but also less burdensome. The language of the time often dressed that in moral terms: the dignity of labour, the virtue of self-support, the moral worth of a person who could make something with their hands. But underneath was the family economy. If Mary could make something, mend something, read something, play something, teach Sunday school, produce fly nets, or manage herself with less help, the household gained time and money. The school's ambition for Mary was, in part, an ambition for the people who would have to take care of Mary after she left. Her education was personal. It was also economic. Where modern viewers may feel the old story change shape, the school was not just a touching reward for Laura's sacrifice. It was an attempt to keep Mary's blindness from permanently shrinking the family. It was an investment made under pressure. The family was paying, in money and labour and distance, for an education whose primary practical return would be measured in Mary's reduced dependence on them. The school was not charity, it was a transaction. The Ingalls family was buying, at considerable cost, a future in which their blind daughter could feed herself, clothe herself, read to herself, and make herself useful enough that the household could continue to function around her. The transaction was worth it. The school did what it was asked to do. Mary left Vinton in 1889 at the age of 24, able to read raised print and New York Point, able to play music, able to sew and bead and make fly nets, able to recite an essay at commencement, able to move through a building without sighted guidance, able to read a letter from her sister without asking someone to read it to her. The quarter bought this, not a romance, not a teaching career, not a husband, a set of skills, a way of living in the dark that did not require another person's eyes, a door back into language that did not pass through Laura's mouth, a door that cost the family 7 years of separation, a territorial appropriation, an unknown number of 12-hour sewing days, and the daily knowledge that their daughter was living in a building they could not picture, learning a thing they could not read from people they could not name, and a door that, within Mary's lifetime, America would quietly close behind her. Because the code she learned, the code the school taught her, the code the curriculum named, the code her textbooks were printed in, the code her fingers would read for the rest of her life, was not the code the country would remember. It was not Braille, it was New York Point. And New York Point, within Mary's lifetime, lost the war for the future of blind literacy in America. That war is coming. The code is coming. The thing the country forgot is coming. But first, one more fact about the school. Mary's conduct in the record received the highest possible mark. That detail can look like sweetness if handled badly. It deserves care. A perfect conduct mark in a strict institution does not simply mean a child was angelic. It may mean discipline. It may mean fear of disappointing the family who paid so much. It may mean that Mary understood how little room she had to fail. It may mean temperament, yes, but also pressure. The good girl remains difficult to read, because good behaviour can be character, and it can also be survival. Mary had reason to obey. Her family had sacrificed. She had travelled far. A return home without progress would not merely be a personal disappointment. It would make the whole family investment feel endangered. She needed the school to work because too many people had paid for it. So she worked. She studied. She practiced. She learned music. She trained her hands. She moved through bells and schedules. She absorbed a system built to make blind students useful in a world that had limited patience for anyone who could not work. The thing America forgot. The raised dot reading system Mary Ingalls learned at the Iowa College for the Blind was not Braille. It was a competing system called New York Point. It had been invented in the 1860s and 70s by a man named William Bell Waite, the superintendent of the New York Institute for the Education of the Blind, who believed his system was more efficient than the Braille that had been developed in France and was then spreading in competing American and English forms through the schools of the United States. New York Point used dots. Braille used dots, but the dots were arranged differently. New York Point used symbols that could vary in width. 2-dot symbols, 3-dot symbols, 4-dot symbols, laid out horizontally on the page, with the wider symbols standing for the letters, and combinations the system's designer believed appeared most often in English. Braille, in its standard form, used a fixed cell of 6 dots, arranged in a 2x3 rectangle, with each cell standing for a single letter, number, or punctuation mark. The two systems were not interchangeable. A reader trained in one could not without retraining read the other. The textbooks printed in one could not be read by a student trained in the other. The teachers who taught one could not, without learning the other, teach a student who had been trained in it. Not a small disagreement. A war. People later called it the War of the Dots. The phrase sounds almost comic. A war over dots. A war over the shape and arrangement of small raised bumps on a piece of paper. A war fought in schoolrooms and printing offices and institutional boardrooms by educators and administrators and advocates for the blind, for the future of how blind Americans would read. It was not comic. For blind readers, the dots were not technical. They were access. If your school taught one system and the books available later used another, your education did not vanish, but it became less portable. If the country printed more material in a competing code, your fingers met a public world not built for you. If standardization came after you had already trained, you belonged to the generation that carried the old system in your hands. Mary Ingalls belonged to that generation, She entered Vinton in 1881. The national settlement around English Braille would not fully arrive until decades later. In the meantime, American blind education lived with competing systems. New York Point, American Braille, English Braille, raised print and other older tactile methods still in institutional memory. The page was not neutral. The page was politics. The choice of which dots to teach a blind child was, in those years, a choice about which future that child would be able to read. William Bell Waite believed New York Point had advantages. Its supporters argued for economy. New York Point could fit more text on a page, because its variable width symbols were more compact than Braille's fixed cells. They argued for efficiency. New York Point, they claimed, could be read faster by trained fingers. They argued for patriotism. New York Point was an American invention, designed for American readers, by an American educator in an American institution. Why should an American blind child learn a French system when an American system was available? Critics pointed to problems with New York Point. The punctuation was inconsistent. The capitalization rules were awkward. The system handled some common English combinations poorly. Braille, especially English Braille, had its own problems, but its fixed cell structure made it easier to teach, easier to print, easier to standardize across institutions, and easier to extend to mathematics, music, and foreign languages. Braille was, in the long run, the more adaptable system. Braille, in the long run, won. The long run took a long time. The War of the Dots was not settled in Mary's years at Vinton. It was not settled in the decade after she graduated. It was not fully settled until the early decades of the 20th century, when the American printing houses, the schools, and the national organizations of and for the blind began, slowly and painfully, to converge on a standard. By the time the convergence was complete, Mary was middle-aged. By the time America had settled on English Braille as the national standard, the textbooks she had read at Vinton were already becoming obsolete. By the time the last New York Point presses went quiet, the system she'd learned was already on its way to the archive. Why this chapter is called the code under her fingers. The code was real. The code was practical. The code was taught. The code carried Mary from the print world into the touch world, gave her back a private life of the mind, let her read letters from her sister without asking someone to read them aloud, let her read the Bible in church without a sighted person beside her, let her read the raised print sheet music that let her play the piano, let her read whatever else the school's small library had embossed for its students. The code was her door back into language. And America closed the door, not maliciously, not with a single decision, not with a national announcement that New York Point was finished and everyone who had learned it was now illiterate. The door closed the way doors close in institutional history, slowly, through 1,000 small decisions, in 1,000 small meetings, by 1,000 small adjustments of curriculum and printing, and teacher training and library acquisition. Each school that switched from New York Point to Braille made a small decision. Each printing house that stopped producing New York Point textbooks made a small decision. Each teacher who retired and was replaced by a teacher trained in Braille made a small decision. None of the decisions individually was a betrayal. All of them, together, closed the door. By the time Mary died in 1928, the door was almost shut. By the time Laura's first book was published in 1932, the door was shut. The textbooks Mary had read in Vinton were, by then, in the archive. The teachers who had taught her were retired or dead. The system she had spent 7 years learning was, in the public memory, already on its way to being forgotten. Braille did not always feel inevitable. Hard to imagine now, because Braille won so completely in public memory that it feels as if it had been waiting there from the beginning. The word Braille is, today, almost synonymous with blind literacy. To say a person reads Braille is to say they read, full stop, in the only way a blind person is widely imagined to read. The idea that there was ever a serious rival, that there was for decades a real and contested fight over which dots blind Americans would learn, has been so thoroughly erased from public memory that most sighted people asked to name a competing system would not be able to name one. There was one. There was more than one. Mary Ingalls learned one of them, and America forgot. Mary was not cheated by Vinton in the simple sense. The school taught what its era taught. It gave her real skills. It restored confidence. It gave access. But history can make honest education look fragile after the fact. A system can be legitimate in its moment and still become obscure later. That obscurity is what makes Mary feel unreadable now. Most people cannot read the code. Most people cannot even picture it. Most people hear blind school and think Braille. Slowly, the wrong assumption leaves the room. Mary's story is not just the story of a blind girl learning to read. It is the story of a blind girl learning to read inside a country that had not yet decided how blind Americans should read. The line changes the scale. Suddenly, Mary's private life intersects with a national history of disability, education, printing, and power. She is no longer only the sister in a pioneer family. She's a student inside a system that reveals how young, blind literacy infrastructure really was. She's a participant in a war she did not choose, on a side that would lose, in a fight whose outcome she did not live to see fully resolved. The bridge to the present can land quietly. The connection is already there. The present does not need a lecture. The old dots make the point. Even now, access depends on formats. A file that one person opens instantly may be closed to another because the format is wrong. A book that exists in print may not exist in an accessible version. A website can be public and still unreadable. A system can claim to include everyone while quietly choosing which bodies it was built for. Mary's world was paper and raised dots. Ours is screens and code. The old problem remains recognizable. Access is never just the information. It is the form the information takes. Mary's education depended on form. Raised dots, New York point, print adapted to touch. A school with the tools to teach it. Money to send her there. A train to reach it. A family willing and able, barely to let her go. The full system. Not courage alone, not family love alone. Infrastructure. The word the old story hides, because infrastructure does not fit easily beside a fiddle. But it belongs here. Mary's future depended on public and private systems working together. Family labour, territorial support, school capacity, trained teachers, embossed material, tactile codes, and social permission for a blind girl to be educated. When any part of that chain weakened, Mary paid. When any part worked, Mary gained. And when the code changed, history paid the expense in memory. Hold the code. We will come back to it. When we talk about the war that ended it. When we talk about the woman who learned it and the country that forgot. When we talk, at the end, about the page Mary could read and we cannot. But the school was more than the code. The school was also a place. A place with bells and dormitories and meals and examinations and conduct marks, and a graduating class of 8, and a commencement essay whose title would, in retrospect, sound like a command addressed to the entire life of the woman who recited it. Vinton gave Mary structure. It also took her away. Both things are true. Easy sentiment fails here. If Vinton becomes only salvation, the separation disappears. If Vinton becomes only institutional coldness, Mary's achievement disappears. The record gives the harder truth. Vinton gave Mary tools her family could not give her, and the price of those tools was distance from the people whose sacrifice had sent her there. Mary's first year placed her among other students from different ages and backgrounds. The account of the school describes a population of regular students and industrial students, some very young, some adults. Blindness did not create one kind of life. It gathered many interrupted lives into the same institution. That must have mattered to Mary. At home, she had been exceptional. The blind daughter, the one the household arranged itself around, the one whose needs had to be anticipated because she could not see to anticipate them herself. At school, she was one among many. There is mercy in that kind of ordinary. A girl who had been the blind daughter could become simply a student who had lessons, examinations, friendships, meals, rules, and expectations. She could be compared not to sighted sisters, but to other blind students. She could be judged on conduct, class standing, music, and work. The evidence shows her conduct reached the highest mark. That detail can look like sweetness if handled badly. It deserves care. A perfect conduct mark in a strict institution does not simply mean a child was angelic. It may mean discipline. It may mean fear of disappointing the family who paid so much. It may mean that Mary understood how little room she had to fail. It may mean temperament, yes, but also pressure. The Good Girl remains difficult to read, because good behaviour can be character, and it can also be survival. Mary had reason to obey. Her family had sacrificed. She had travelled far. A return home without progress would not merely be a personal disappointment. It would make the whole family investment feel endangered. She needed the school to work because too many people had paid for it. So she worked, she studied, she practiced, she learned music, she trained her hands, she moved through bells and schedules. She absorbed a system built to make blind students useful in a world that had limited patience for anyone who could not work. The industrial courses are where the old world shows its teeth. Sewing, beadwork, knitting, fly nets, cane seating, brooms, mattresses, hammocks, piano tuning, carpet weaving. Not hobbies in the modern sense. Survival skills placed inside education. The institution understood that a blind person might need to produce value in order to be granted dignity by a society already inclined to see disability as dependence. Mary's quick fingers became part of that story. When she returned home after her first year, her beadwork impressed the family. The moment is small, but it carries weight. A blind daughter comes home not only changed by loss, but changed by skill. She can make something beautiful. She can show proof that the money was not wasted. She can place work in the hands of people who feared for her future. She can let her parents hold the beadwork and think, she is going to be all right. Not a small victory. The family needed that proof. They had paid for it, in 25-cent installments, in 12-hour sewing days, in territorial appropriations, in train tickets, in 9 months of absence. They needed to see, in Mary's hands, the evidence that the expense had been worth paying. The beadwork was that evidence. It was small and it was beautiful, and it was made by a girl who could not see it, and it sat in the palms of her parents who could. But victory did not erase the system around it. The school expected girls to spend time in sewing. It expected order. It expected silence. It expected performance. It expected the blind body to become trained, productive, and socially acceptable. The line between empowerment and discipline is thin in institutions like this. The school could enlarge Mary's life and still press her into the narrow forms of usefulness the century allowed. Why the story should not be told as Mary went away and everything became better. Everything did not become better. It became possible. Possible is not the same as easy. Mary's education also carried interruptions. Records indicate she was absent during one school year, with illness or lack of funds suggested but not known with certainty. That uncertainty matters. The archive does not give everything. Even inside the story of education, instability remained. Mary did not move through the course as a frictionless heroine. Money, health, and distance still pressed on her. The family that was paying for her education could not always pay. The body that had been damaged by the illness that took her sight was not always well. The distance between Smet and Vinton, 400 miles by rail, was not always easy to cross. A particular kind of grief lives inside a year of absence from a school like that. The student who has to go home in the middle of a course, for reasons the record does not fully explain, is a student who knows that the path is not guaranteed. The other students continue. The classes move on. The curriculum does not wait. The student who returns the next year or the year after has to take up the work where she left it, in a class that may now be younger than she is, with teachers who have moved on to other students, in a building that has continued without her. We do not know exactly what Mary's absence felt like. The record does not preserve her feelings. It preserves only the fact of the absence and the eventual fact of her return. We can imagine the absence only by placing it beside everything else we know. Beside the quarter, beside the train, beside the high conduct marks, beside the beadwork that impressed the family. The absence sits inside the story like a crack in a wall. The wall holds, the crack is still there, and yet she finished. In June of 1889, at the age of 24, Mary Ingalls graduated from the Iowa College for the Blind. She was one of 8 graduates, 5 women, 3 men. At commencement, she recited an essay by Robert Burns titled Bide a Wee and Dinner Weary. Wait a little. Do not grow weary. The title almost feels too perfect. A blind woman whose family had waited through illness, money pressure, separation, and years of schooling. A family that had waited through the year of absence whose cause remains uncertain, that had waited through every long winter when the train could not run and the letters could not arrive, that had waited through every examination result and every conduct report and every tuition payment, stood at commencement and recited a text whose title told people not to tire. The detail is powerful because it was real. Let it sit, because the harder truth comes right after. Mary graduated, then she went home, not into a professional life like the television version imagined, not into marriage, not into a schoolroom where she became the inspirational blind teacher. The historical Mary returned to Smet and lived most of the rest of her life in the family home. She contributed. She helped. She made fly nets after her father's death. She remained active in church. She lived with Ma, then later with Grace for a time, and finally with Carrie in Keystone. The education opened her world. It did not give her a fully independent one, the hardest adult truth in the entire story. Mary earned more than the world could offer her. Her school record suggests capacity. Her graduation proves endurance. Her training shows skill. But the economy, gender expectations, disability limits, family obligations, and geography of her world narrowed the life available after the achievement. Not failure, constraint. And constraints are often more painful than tragedies because they do not arrive all at once. They become the shape of ordinary days. A blind woman comes home. The house makes room. The family is proud. The years pass. The public story will later give the world the sweetness. It will not give the full sound of that quiet. Stand with Mary on the commencement stage for one more moment. The audience is clapping. Mary cannot see them. She can hear them. Her parents are somewhere in the hall, or perhaps they could not make the trip and are at home in Smet, waiting for a letter that will tell them what happened. Laura may be there, or may not. Carrie and Grace are too young to have come. The other graduates are beside her on the stage. 5 women, 3 men, all of them blind, all of them holding diplomas they cannot read in the ordinary way, all of them about to walk off the stage into a world that has not yet decided what blind adults are for. Mary recites her essay. The audience applauds. The applause is genuine. The applause is also, in a sense, the applause a country gives when it has finished educating a person and is now ready to hand that person back to the family that paid for the education to be looked after for the rest of her life. The applause fades. The stage empties. The class of 1889 scatters. Mary packs her trunk. She has a train to catch. The train is going west this time, back to Smet, back to the chair by the window, back to the fiddle, back to the household that has spent 7 years sending her away and is now about to receive her back. The return is coming. The house is coming. The long quiet of Mary's adulthood is coming. The death in 1928 is near the end. The books in 1932 are after the end. But the code is the thread that runs through all of them. The code Mary learned. The code America forgot. The code that sat under her fingers for the rest of her life, on the pages of the book she read in the chair by the window, in the letters from Laura that she did not need anyone to read aloud, in the sheet music that let her play the piano when the fiddle was not enough. The code was her private doorway back into language. America closed the door. Mary kept reading, on the other side of it, for the rest of her life. After graduation, Mary went back to Smet. The sentence carries the weight of 7 years. For 7 years, with one uncertain interruption, the family had looked toward the school as the answer. Vinton was the place that could train her, restore confidence, teach reading, teach music, build skill, prove possibility. And it did those things. But when the schooling ended, Mary's life did not open into the kind of future modern viewers might expect after such discipline. She returned to the family home. The old dependence changed shape, but it did not disappear. At Vinton, Mary had lived in a building designed for her. The bells rang for her. The classes were arranged for her. The textbooks were printed for her. The teachers were trained for her. The dormitory was designed for her. In Smet, none of that existed. In Smet, Mary was once again the blind daughter in a sighted household. The chair by the window was still there. The fiddle was still there. The book Laura had been reading aloud the night before Mary left for Vinton 7 years before was still on the shelf. The world Mary had been trained to live in was 400 miles east, and she was not in it anymore. The house in Smet became the centre of Mary's remaining life. Caroline and Charles were there. Carrie and Grace were growing up. Laura, by 1889, was 22 years old and would, within 6 years, be married to Almanzo Wilder and living on her own homestead. The household that had sent Mary to Vinton was already beginning to scatter. The household that received her back was smaller and would get smaller, where the public myth misread silence. A quiet life is not an uneventful life. It is often a life whose events were not considered worth recording. Mary's adulthood did not produce the obvious drama of courtship, marriage, childbirth, travel, or authorship. The old record therefore gives us fewer hooks. But the absence is evidence. It tells us what kinds of female lives history was prepared to notice. A woman who married entered records through a husband. A woman who published entered records through print. A woman who inherited or sued entered records through property and court. A blind, unmarried daughter living with her parents entered records only when institutions, census takers, obituaries, or later family historians had a reason to name her. Not that nothing happened, that the archive was not built for her. Mary's life after Vinton asks for a different kind of attention. The attention has to be patient enough to count domestic labour, church work, companionship, financial smallness, and the burden of being loved but not fully free. The books could not easily dwell there. Children's literature moves towards shape. It needs scenes, seasons, school terms, family moments, and endings that feel earned. Mary's adult life resists that shape. It is long, quiet, repetitive, useful, constrained. It does not resolve. It persists. Why she becomes so easy to reduce? Blind sister, good daughter, Laura's responsibility, the girl who needed the money, the one who went to college for the blind. All of those descriptions contain truth. None of them is enough. Because after Vinton, Mary was also a person living inside the aftermath of investment. The family had paid for her education, but education did not remove the need for family. It simply changed the terms. Mary could read tactile systems. She could make things. She could participate more fully. She could teach Sunday school. She could carry dignity. But she still lived in a world where blindness and womanhood together narrowed. Paid work sharply. So she stayed. And staying became her story. Mary's life cannot be reduced to lazy sadness. Sadness is not enough. Mary was not only a victim of illness. She was not only someone who lost sight and then waited to die. She learned. She graduated. She contributed. She had relationships. She had faith. She had a place in the household. But none of that cancels the cost. The cost was not only that she could not see. The cost was that every achievement happened inside a smaller field than her mind deserved. Mary's mind reached farther than her world allowed. The line is the centre of the chapter. It explains why the New York point detail matters so much. A reading code is an instrument of reach. It lets a mind cross distance without eyes. It lets a person access words privately. It says in a physical way your mind can still travel. But Mary's social world did not travel as far as her fingers could. The record does not show her building an independent career. It does not show marriage. It does not show a household of her own. It shows return, family, work, church, and quiet endurance. There is dignity there. There is also loss. Both facts remain. After Charles died, the household tightened around Caroline and Mary. A room rented out. Fly nets made. The family name still small, not yet famous enough to turn old hardship into national memory. Laura had not yet published the books. The Ingalls family was not yet a symbol. They were people aging inside the consequences of decisions made decades earlier. Mary did not live as a beloved literary figure. She lived as Mary. The distinction matters because fame often travels backward and paints the past with light it did not have at the time. Once the books became beloved, every hardship began to look like part of a larger American story. But while the hardship was happening, there was no guarantee that anyone would care. Mary's blindness was not preparation for a franchise. Laura's sewing was not preparation for a fan base. Caroline's grief was not preparation for nostalgia. Charles's failures were not preparation for myth. They were living without knowing that strangers would one day inspect their lives for comfort. Mary died before that inspection began, and that may be the coldest mercy in the story. She never had to see herself simplified, but she also never received the recognition. Where the script has to be most careful, it would be easy to turn Mary's adulthood into a tragedy, to paint the years after Vinton as a long decline, a woman withering in a chair, a life wasted by a world that had no place for her. That would be false. It would also be a betrayal of the woman who actually lived those years. Mary's adulthood was not a decline. It was a continuation. She got up in the morning, she ate breakfast with Caroline, she read her raised dot books, she played the piano, she went to church, she taught Sunday school, she made fly nets, she received letters from Laura and read them herself, she received visits from Carrie and Grace. She lived, in other words, a life. Not the life the school had trained her for, not the life the television show would later invent for her, but a life with the texture and rhythm and small pleasures and small griefs that any life has. The temptation, when telling the story of a constrained life, is to flatten it into either tragedy or saintliness. Mary was neither a tragedy nor a saint. She was a woman who had been given a set of tools and a set of limits, and who used the tools inside the limits for as long as she was given. The tools were real. The limits were real. The life she built inside both was real. What was not real? What was invented later by people who needed Mary to be something other than what she was the romance, the husband, the teaching career, the transformation of blindness into a doorway rather than a wall. That invention is coming, the television version. The story America told itself in the 1970s and 80s about a Mary who did not exist, because the Mary who did exist was too quiet for prime time. But stand in the de Smet house for one more moment. The chair by the window, the fiddle on the wall, the piano in the parlour, the raised dot books on the shelf, the fly nets in progress on the table, the mother in the kitchen, the daughter in the chair, the years passing the way years pass in a small house, on a small street, in a small town on the prairie, slowly and then all at once. Mary is reading. Her fingers are moving across a raised dot page. The page is in New York Point. The page is the door the school gave her. The door is still open for her. America is about to close it, behind her, without telling her. But she does not know that yet. She is reading. The house is quiet. The fiddle is on the wall. Caroline is in the kitchen. The years are passing. The image to hold, not the graduation. Not the commencement essay, not the beadwork that impressed the family. The image to hold is the woman in the chair, reading in a quiet house, in a small town, in the years before anyone outside the family knew her name. The Mary the books would later make beautiful. The Mary the television show would later give a husband. The Mary America would later remember wrong. She is reading. She does not know any of that is coming. She is reading, in the only code she was ever taught, in the only door that was ever opened for her, in the small, quiet house that America would one day turn into a museum. The museum is real. The house is real. The chair is real. The books on the shelf are real. The Mary most people know is not. Charles Ingalls died in 1902. The date changes the room. For most of the public story, Pa is motion. Pa makes plans. Pa plays the fiddle. Pa promises that the next place will be better. Pa carries a restlessness that the books often turn into courage. Even when his choices hurt the family, his presence gives the story a centre of movement. He can fail, but he fails actively. He moves, and the family moves with him, and the moving becomes the story. Mary's later life is different. After Pa died, the movement slowed. Caroline remained. Mary remained. The house in Smet had to become not a staging ground for the next move, but a place where two women managed what was left. Not the part nostalgia likes. Nostalgia prefers the wagon before the destination, the fiddle before the expense, the snow before the hunger sits too long in the room. But after Charles died, there was no new frontier to romanticize. There was a widow, a blind daughter, a small household economy, and the quiet work of making the days continue, where Mary's education met its second test. The first test was school. The second was usefulness after the family structure changed. Mary made fly nets for horses, work that brought in some income. Fly nets were practical objects. They helped keep insects off horses in warm weather. They were made of string, knotted and tied into a mesh, in patterns that a blind woman who had been trained in handwork could produce without sight. There is no glamour in fly nets. There is no romance in fly nets. There is no scene in any little house book where Mary sits down to make fly nets, because fly nets do not fit the texture of the books. They are not picturesque. They are not sentimental. They are not even particularly interesting. They are a thing made by hand for a world of animals, roads, summer heat, and small money. Why the detail matters. A fly net is not a symbol invented by a storyteller. It is a thing made by a real woman, with real hands, for a real market, for real money, in a real economy that had very little room for her. That kind of object brings Mary back into the physical world. Not angel, not shadow, hands working. The same hands that learned raised dots also tied, knotted, measured and made. The same hands that lost the inked page found other surfaces of use. The same fingers that moved across a New York point page also moved across the strings of a fly net, in the same small repetitive motions, producing value in the only currency the household could spend. There is dignity in that. There is also a limit. Dignity cannot become a cover for the limit. A woman making fly nets after years of specialised education may be admirable, but it also shows how narrow the door remained. Mary had studied literature, music, arithmetic, history, grammar, raised print, and New York point. She had performed at commencement. She had lived in an institution designed to train blind students. And still, the work available to her inside the family economy remained modest. The adult wound. Not that Mary did nothing, that the world gave her too little to do with what she had become. The public loves stories of overcoming because overcoming makes the injury feel answered. Mary's life refuses that comfort. She overcame enough to graduate, but not enough to escape the structures around her. She gained literacy, but not public voice. She gained skill, but not full independence. She gained education, but not the kind of career television later invented for her, because audiences needed the wound to pay off in a recognisable way. The real payoff was smaller. It was also harder. It was a blind woman helping a household stay alive after the father died. The house itself becomes important here, not as a tourist site, as a pressure chamber. Imagine Caroline and Mary there after Charles, two women bound by love, need, memory, grief and habit. Caroline had already watched the family move, fail, rebuild, bury, endure and shrink. Mary had already spent years away at school and then returned. Now the father whose dreams had driven so much of the family motion was gone. What remains when the dreamer leaves? The people who paid for the dreams. The point reaches beyond Mary. Caroline paid too. Laura paid. Carrie and Grace paid. But Mary paid in a particular way. The family's story of motion became a story of staying for her. Blindness anchored her more than sight would have. Education expanded her, but it did not send her into a wide outside life. Her adult geography stayed small. The contradiction becomes the story. School gave Mary movement by touch. Life gave her walls. The house, after Pa, prevents any easy ending at graduation. Costs do not end when ceremonies do. They change form. Mary's cost after Vinton was not tuition. It was the shape of decades. Decades are difficult to dramatise because they do not always announce themselves. They gather, meal by meal, letter by letter, Sunday by Sunday, small task by small task. A woman can spend a life inside repetition and still have that life contain courage, intelligence, disappointment, faith, tenderness, irritation, boredom, and private longing. We do not know all of Mary's private longing. That absence is important. It is tempting to fill it. A weaker version would invent her thoughts. It would say she wished for marriage, wished for sight, wished for travel, wished for fame, wished for one more chance at childhood. Maybe some of that was true. Maybe not. The record does not give permission to speak as if we know. A more honest path remains. It must name what can be known and let the unknown remain heavy. We know she returned home. We know she did not marry. We know she lived with family. We know she worked. We know she remained remembered as intelligent and capable. We know the public story arrived too late for her to answer. We do not know the full weather of her private mind. That missing weather is not a problem to solve. It is part of the historical truth. Some lives come down to us with diaries, letters, court documents, confessions, speeches, interviews, and enemies writing things down. Mary's life comes down more quietly. The quiet is not empty. It is a locked room. No voice should pretend to have the key, but we can stand outside the door and name the lock. After Charles died, the lock becomes easier to see. Mary and Caroline had to continue without the man whose public memory later carried so much warmth. The books often let readers love Pa because they meet him through Laura's child eyes. The adult record makes him more complicated, hopeful, restless, tender, impractical, loving, costly. People are not verdicts. Pa does not have to become villain for Mary's cost to be real. The better question is not whether Charles loved Mary. He did. The better question is what love could not pay for. Love could not prevent the illness. Love could not restore sight. Love could not make private reading possible without a school. Love could not remove tuition. Love could not create a public career for a blind woman in that place and time. Love could not stop the code she learned from losing the national argument. Love was present. It was not enough. Often the most painful truth inside family history. People want to believe that enough love rescues everyone. The evidence shows otherwise. Love can carry. It cannot always liberate. Mary was carried. She was not fully liberated. The house after Pa proves it. The room rented out. The fly nets took shape. Carolyn cooked and cleaned and grew older. Mary read and sewed and played and went to church and grew older. The years passed. Laura in Missouri was raising Rose and writing farm articles and beginning slowly to think about the book she would one day write. Carrie was working in the Black Hills. Grace was married and farming. The Ingalls family, which had once been a single household moving across a continent, was now a small scatter of adults in different towns, connected by letters and occasional visits, growing into middle age. Mary was the one who stayed. Mary, who could not easily travel alone, who could not easily live alone, who could not easily support herself alone, stayed with her mother in the house in Smet, in the room with the chair by the window, in the life the school had trained her for and the world had not yet learned to use. The years did what years do. Carolyn aged, Mary aged, the household contracted, the room rented out brought in a little money, the fly nets brought in a little money, the church brought in community, the letters from Laura brought in news, the raised dot books on the shelf brought in the only private life of the mind Mary had, and the code on those books was already becoming a relic. America was moving slowly toward Braille. The presses that printed New York Point were slowing. The teachers who taught it were retiring. The schools that used it were switching, one by one, to the system that would, in the end, be the only system the country remembered. Mary did not switch. Mary could not switch. Mary had spent 7 years learning New York Point, and her fingers knew it the way a sighted person's eyes know the alphabet, automatically, without thought, as the shape of language itself. To switch, in middle age, would have been to learn to read again. Some did. Mary, so far as the record shows, did not. She kept reading the books on her shelf. The books grew older. The pages grew more fragile. The code on them grew more obsolete. But the fingers that read them did not forget. The fingers kept moving across the dots, the way they had moved in the reading room at Vinton, the way they had moved in the chair by the window into Smet, the way they would move for as long as Mary had hands, the image to hold through what is coming, the fingers moving, the dots rising, the code that America was forgetting, still being read in a small house, in a small town on the prairie, by a woman who had been trained into it at considerable cost, and who had no reason to switch, and no opportunity to switch, and perhaps no desire to switch, because the code was not, for her, a system. The code was her language. The code was the door the school had opened. The door was still open for her, even as America was closing it behind her. The house, after Pa, was not a sorrowful house. It was not a tragic house. It was a real house with two women in it, getting older, doing the work that needed doing, reading the books that needed reading, playing the music that needed playing, going to the church that needed going to, and waiting, slowly, patiently, without drama, for whatever came next. What came next was the rest of Mary's life. Carrie in Keystone, a stroke, pneumonia, a grave in Smet. But before that, the books, the little house books, the thing that arrived after Mary was gone, that turned her into a character she had never met, that gave her a romance she had never had, that fixed her in the public memory as the sweet blind sister whose story America could love because America had made the story soft enough to love. The television version gave Mary a different life. Not a small matter, because for millions of viewers, the television version is the emotional truth, even when the historical record says otherwise. On television, Mary becomes a teacher. She marries. She has a dramatic romantic arc. Her blind school life is compressed into a story that modern audiences can understand quickly. Loss, bitterness, training, love, purpose. The fictional Adam Kendall walks into her classroom, into her life, into her heart, and the audience exhales, because the wound has finally produced a doorway. It works as television. It fails as biography. The real Mary Ingalls never married. She did not become a professional teacher in the way the show imagined. She returned home after Vinton. The fictional Adam Kendall did not walk into her historical life and give the audience a romance to relieve the discomfort of her blindness. There was no Adam Kendall. There was no classroom of her own. There was no dramatic reunion in a hotel room after a fire. There was no miscarriage, no crisis of faith, no dramatic recovery of sight in a hospital corridor. There was Smet. There was the chair by the window. There was Caroline. And then there was Grace. And then there was Carrie. There were fly nets, and church, and letters from Laura, and the raised dot books on the shelf, and the long quiet of an adulthood that the show could not have sold to a network. The relief is the point. Television often cannot bear a life that remains constrained. It wants transformation. It wants a wound that becomes a doorway to love. It wants disability to produce inspiration quickly enough for the episode to close. It wants tears, then relief, then the feeling that the story has redeemed the pain. The historical Mary offers no such bargain. Her blindness did not deliver a husband. Her education did not deliver public independence. Her suffering did not resolve into a clean inspirational arc. She lived. Harder to dramatize, also more honest. The television changes reveal what audiences prefer. We prefer Mary with a romance because romance tells us her life was not diminished. We prefer Mary as a teacher because vocation tells us the education paid off in a form we recognize. We prefer a blind school that exists as a stage for personal breakthrough, not as an institution inside a contested history of tactile literacy. We prefer Braille because Braille is familiar. We do not prefer New York Point because New York Point requires explanation, and explanation disturbs comfort. But the disturbance is where the truth lives. The real story does not need Adam Kendall. It has the War of the Dots. It has a medical mystery. It has a 12-hour sewing day. It has Dakota territorial support. It has a curriculum that named the code. It has a girl whose education was both rescue and constraint. It has a woman who died before the books made her famous. Enough. More than enough. The temptation is to blame television for changing the facts. But television was doing what adaptation often does, turning a life into a shape the audience can bear. The books had already made choices. The show made different ones. Each version moved the person named Mary farther from the archive and closer to emotional usefulness. Emotional usefulness is not the same as truth. The first fracture in the easy version. Mary became useful to different stories. In the books, she helped define Laura's duty, conscience, and growth. On television, she helped tell a story of overcoming, romance, and faith. In fan memory, she became the beloved blind sister. Each version carries affection. None of them fully returns Mary to herself. The record cannot fully return her either. The tragedy. But it can resist the softest lies. It can tell us Mary was born on January 10th, 1865. It can tell us she lost her sight after an illness the family version called scarlet fever, while later medical analysis points toward brain fever or viral meningoencephalitis. It can tell us she enrolled at the Iowa College for the Blind on November 23, 1881. It can tell us Laura helped by basting shirts for 25 cents for a 12-hour day. It can tell us the school curriculum included New York Point. It can tell us Mary graduated in June of 1889. It can tell us she returned home, never married, made fly nets, lived with family, had a stroke in Keystone, died of pneumonia on October 20th, 1928, and was buried in Smet. Those facts do not give us everything. They give us enough to stop making her smaller. The television, Mary got a love story because audiences understand love stories. The historical Mary got a code, a commencement, a household, and a long quiet afterward. The code is harder, so we follow the code. The Little House books made hardship beautiful. Not an accusation, part of their power. Laura Ingalls. Wilder took hunger, cold, debt, failure, isolation, grasshoppers, unfinished houses, broken plans, and endless movement, and she gave generations of readers a world they could enter without being destroyed by it. She made the past readable for children. She made danger survivable on the page. She made a family that the country could love, because the family was warm inside even when the world outside was cold. But beauty has a cost. When hardship becomes beautiful, someone has to ask what was sanded down. In Mary's case, the sanding is subtle. The books do not erase her. They love her, but they place her inside the moral architecture of the family. Mary's blindness helps reveal Laura's duty, the family's sacrifice, and the pioneer ethic of endurance. The emotional outcome is powerful. The historical outcome is partial. What gets softened? The medical uncertainty, the public support, the full economic burden, the technical history of her education, the adult quiet after graduation, the fact that the code named in her school world later lost its place, the fact that Mary died before she could see herself turned into literature. The books made the family beautiful because beauty helps memory travel. But beauty can travel farther than truth, the final pressure point. Viewers who love Little House are not mocked. They are trusted enough to hold two truths at once. The books can be beloved and incomplete. Laura can be sincere and selective. Mary can be loved and still reduced. A childhood classic can preserve a person and hide parts of her in the same gesture. A mature reader can hold that. The story can invite them there. The central image returns. The page under Mary's fingers. Raised dots. A code. A mind meeting words by touch. That image is better than any moral lesson because it contains the whole story. Mary's body changed. The family paid, the school taught. The code carried language, the code faded. The books came later. The public remembered the wrong simple thing. And still Mary read. The line that must not be lost. She read. Not with Laura's eyes. Not only through someone else's voice. With her own hands. The fact deserves reverence because it was not given cheaply. It was purchased by labour, support, distance, discipline, and the willingness of a blind girl to learn the world again through skin. The old story often makes Mary seem acted upon. Illness happened to her. Laura read to her. The family sent her. The school received her. History remembered her. But Mary also acted. She studied. She learned. She graduated. She worked. She endured. Mary does not need to become a modern heroine with modern freedom she did not have. That would be another falsification. The better work is to show the exact size of the cage and the exact strength of the person inside it. Mary's cage was not one thing. It was illness. It was poverty. It was distance. It was gender. It was disability. It was an educational system still fighting over dots. It was a family story that would later need her to be gentle. It was a public memory that preferred her inspiring. And inside that cage she learned a code. She made work, she finished school, she lived. Not small, that is the story. Mary Ingalls did not leave us a famous book. The one absence shapes everything. Laura did. Rose did. The family story entered the world through words written, revised, edited, marketed, and read by strangers. The Ingalls name became literary property. The Prairie became a place readers could enter. Childhood became a national memory. But Mary did not become author of her own public life. The older sister learned literacy the hard way. The younger sister became literature. The contrast should not be rushed. There is no need to turn it into jealousy. The record does not require us to imagine Mary resenting Laura's later authorship. Mary died before that authorship changed the family's public meaning. The point is not envy. The point is narrative control. Mary had to learn how to read again after blindness. But when her life became readable to the public, someone else had written the page. The central irony, not an accusation, a structure. Every famous family contains people whose lives become known because one relative had a pen. The writer preserves them, but the writer also fixes them in a certain light. Mary was preserved in Laura's light. Warm light, loving light, limited light. What would Mary's own light have shown? We do not know. The wound. A person might ask, did Mary keep private letters? Did she write in New York Point? Did she compose thoughts by touch? Did she preserve anything that would let us hear her without Laura between us? The surviving public story does not give enough, and that lack should not be filled with fantasy. Instead, it should be made visible. The absence of Mary's public voice tells us something about the period, the family, the archive, and disability. A sighted author could enter print. A blind woman trained in a tactile system could read and perhaps write within her own circle. But the path from that private literacy to public authorship was far narrower. Even if Mary wrote more than we know, the systems that preserved and published family memory did not make her the voice. Why New York Point becomes more than a course listing. It becomes a symbol of private access that did not become public power. Mary could read, Mary could learn, Mary could recite, Mary could produce work, but the public page belonged to Laura. Laura deserves gentleness here. There is no need to punish a writer for being the one whose work survived. Laura's books are why Mary is remembered at all by millions. But affection should not prevent analysis. The public record was shaped by a sighted sister writing later, within the demands of children's literature, publishing, memory, and collaboration. Mary's own body of knowledge did not shape the books in the same way. Where the difference between being remembered and being heard begins to matter. Mary was remembered. Was she heard? The question cannot be fully answered. It can only be carried. If a person is loved in someone else's story, the love may be real. But the person's interior life remains partly unreachable. Mary may have had opinions sharper than the books allow. She may have disliked certain memories. She may have joked, complained, corrected, resented, forgave, or understood things Laura did not. She may have known family secrets that were never printed. She may have held quiet judgments about Pa's restlessness, Ma's sacrifices, Laura's ambition, Carrie's frailty, Grace's later life, and her own fate. Maybe. The record stops there, because the archive does not let us say more. But maybe still has pressure inside it. It reminds us that historical people are larger than surviving evidence. The absence of evidence is not a blank check for invention, but it is also not proof that a person was simple. Mary was not simple because the record is thin. The record is thin because history often thins women like her, blind, unmarried, domestic, private, useful, remembered through another. That combination makes a person easy to flatten. The flattening is what this story resists. It does so by returning to hard points: birth, illness, medical uncertainty, reading aloud, 25 cents, Vinton, the code, graduation, return, work, death before publication. Each hard point becomes a nail holding Mary's outline in place. Without those nails, the story floats. With them, she has shape. The question of voice also changes the way we hear the title. Little House Never Told You can sound like accusation, but the more precise meaning is this. The public version did not carry everything the record later allows us to see. Sometimes it did not know. Sometimes it simplified. Sometimes it selected. Sometimes the genre could not bear the weight. Sometimes the adult facts would have broken the children's frame, not scandal, history. The scandal is what happens if we refuse to update the memory once better evidence is available. Mary's voice cannot be recovered fully, but the public picture can be corrected. Correction is not betrayal. Correction is care. If the audience loves Mary, it should want the harder version, not because the harder version is darker, but because it is closer to the person. Love that requires the subject to stay simple is not love. It is possession. Mary Ingalls does not belong to nostalgia. She belongs to the record, and the record is not finished with her. An old raised dot page, not a printed page with ink faded brown at the edges. Not a family Bible with names written in a hand someone can still read. A tactile page. Dots pressed upward from paper. The surface carrying words for fingers, not eyes. Now imagine the code is New York Point. Most people looking at it would see pattern, not language. They could touch the bumps and still remain illiterate. They could feel the surface and understand almost nothing. The page would be present and closed at the same time. Mary's public memory, present, closed. People know her name. They know she went blind. They know Laura loved her. They know she went to a blind school. Some know the television version gave her a marriage she did not have. Fewer know the medical story is disputed. Fewer still know the school curriculum named New York Point. Fewer still can explain why that matters. The page is there. The code is missing. The work now is to give enough of the code to read the life differently. Not all of it. That would be impossible. Enough. Enough to see that Mary's blindness was not just a plot point. Enough to see that Laura's sewing was not just sweetness. Enough to see that Vinton was not a vague inspirational school. Enough to see that tactile literacy in America had its own politics. Enough to see that the television version softened the adult facts. Enough to see that Mary died before the books, which means the Mary millions love is a version she never publicly met. Once known, the old story cannot return unchanged. The point. Affection is not destroyed by precision. It becomes stronger. At this stage, every earlier object returns. The 25 cents returns as a coin in Laura's hand. The shirt returns as fabric under a child's fingers. The train returns as distance between Mary and home. The raised dot page returns as Mary's private doorway. The school bell returns as discipline. The commencement title returns as command. Wait a little. Do not grow weary. The fly net returns as proof that education did not remove the need for modest labour. The book publication date returns as the final cruelty. Public memory opening after Mary closed her eyes for the last time. The code ties them together. Not a cheap twist or a sudden accusation, a reordering of weight. Mary's education was not merely a chapter of recovery. It was part of a larger story about access, money, family labour, public support, contested literacy, and later simplification. The thing they thought was simple has become structural. Mary's blindness touched every system around her. Family, school, government, publishing, adaptation, memory. And because she was not the public author, each system left a mark on her without handing her the last word. Why the page nobody can open matters. It turns our own position into part of the story. We too have been reading Mary through translation, through Laura, through television, through childhood memory, through summaries, through assumptions about Braille, through the comfort of the scarlet fever explanation. The audience has been sighted, but not necessarily literate. The line is sharp, because it is not an insult. It means the audience could see Mary all along and still not read her correctly. They had access to the image, not the code. Now enough code is on the table to show what was missing. The pull comes from recognition, not trivia. The audience realizes it accepted the easy version, and the realization feels like a locked drawer opening. No one has to be insulted. Discovery is stronger than scolding. The drawer here contains no scandalous letter. It contains a curriculum list. Better, because a curriculum list is not designed to manipulate emotion. It is ordinary. Raised print, the tactile code, music, literature, industrial work. The emotional force comes from placing the list beside Mary's life. The record does not perform. It simply sits there and changes everything. The premium tone, no yelling, no fake cliff, just the document and the wound. One final turn remains. Mary as hidden subject becomes Mary as measure. She becomes a measure of how we read history. If we can let her remain complicated, we can read better. If we need her to stay sweet, steady and simple, then we are still using her. Mary cannot stop us. The responsibility is ours. Caroline Ingalls died in April of 1924. The date changes the room again. The house in Smet, which had held 2 women for more than 20 years, was now going to hold one. Mary was 59 years old. She had outlived her father. She was about to outlive her mother, the chair by the window, the piano in the parlour, the shelf of raised-up books, the fiddle on the wall. All of it was about to belong to a household that no longer contained the people who had made it a home. Mary could not live alone, not in Smet, not in 1924, not as a blind woman in her 60s. The family arranged what families arranged in those years, when a member could not live independently. Mary went to live with her sister Grace in the town of Manchester, South Dakota for a time. Then, later, she went to live with her sister Carrie in Keystone, South Dakota in the Black Hills, where Carrie and her husband had settled. Keystone is a different country from Smet. The prairie gives way to hills. The flat fields give way to pine and rock. The railroad town gives way to a mining and tourist settlement on the edge of the mountains in the corner of the state where the country had carved the faces of presidents into a cliffside and was beginning to call it a monument. Mary, in her last years, lived in the shadow of a mountain. America was turning into a symbol, in a town she had not grown up in the household of a sister who had her own life and her own complications. We do not know much about Mary's last years. The record, which had been thin all along, becomes thinner. She was old, she was blind, she was living with family in a town not her own, in a region not her own, in a body that was beginning to fail her in ways the blindness had not. Then, in 1928, a stroke. The record does not give us the date of the stroke. It gives us only the date of what came after, October 20th, 1928. Mary Ingalls in Keystone, South Dakota, in the house of her sister Carrie, died of pneumonia following the stroke. She was 63 years old, 63, born January 10th, 1865, dead October 20th, 1928. A life of 63 years, 14 of them sighted, 49 of them blind, 7 of them spent at a school in Iowa learning a code America would forget. The rest of them spent in houses that belonged to other people, in towns that other people had chosen, in a life that other people had shaped. The body was taken back to Smet. She was buried there, in the family plot, beside the father who had shared her birthday, and the mother who had held the household together through every move. The town she had lived in longest. The town the books would later make famous. The town that would, in time, become a tourist destination for readers who wanted to see the place where the Little House books had been set. Mary's grave is in Smet. You can visit it. You can stand beside it. You can read the name on the stone, Mary Amelia Ingalls, born January 10th, 1865, died October 20th, 1928. And you can know, standing there, that the woman under the stone never read the books that made her famous, never saw the television show that gave her a husband, never heard the medical analysis that questioned the scarlet fever story, never heard anyone call her code dead, never met the Mary that millions of readers thought they knew. She lived the life before the meaning was assigned. The most honest sentence in this entire script. Everyone in history does. They live first. We assign meaning later. The danger is that our meanings become too neat. Mary, the steady blind sister. Mary, the tragedy. Mary, the saint. Mary, the burden that made Laura work. Mary, the innocent. Mary, the lesson. Those meanings are too small. At her grave, she was not a lesson. She was a woman who had been a baby in a Wisconsin cabin, and a girl on a moving wagon, and a teenager who lost her sight, and a student at a school in Iowa, and a graduate reciting Burns at commencement, and a daughter in a chair by a window, and a sister reading letters from Missouri, and a maker of fly nets, and a teacher of Sunday school, and a member of a church, and a woman who had a stroke in Keystone and died of pneumonia in October, and was carried home to Smet to be buried beside the people who had paid for her to learn to read in the dark. The Mary the grave holds. The grave does not hold a character. The grave holds a woman. America has spent almost 100 years confusing the two. The grave does not care. The grave holds what it holds. 4 years after Mary died, the first Little House book was published. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 65 years old when Little House in the Big Woods appeared in 1932. 65. She had been writing in various forms for decades, farm articles, columns, occasional essays, but she had not until then published the books that would make her one of the most read children's authors in American history. The first book appeared, then the second, then the third. By the end of the 1930s, the Ingalls family was becoming a national memory. By the end of the 1940s, the books were a cornerstone of American childhood. By the 1970s, the television show had turned them into a weekly ritual for millions of households. Mary had been dead since 1928. She never saw the books arrive. She never saw readers fall in love with Ma, Pa, Laura, Carrie, Grace, Almanzo, and Mary. She never watched children turn the family into imaginary kin. She never saw television reshape her. She never heard strangers say scarlet fever with certainty. She never heard modern readers learn that New York Point was in the curriculum. She never heard anyone call her code dead. She lived the life before the meaning was assigned. The detonation. The Mary that millions of readers love is a Mary who never met the books. The Mary in the books is a character constructed by Laura, from memory, in the years after the real Mary was already in the ground. The real Mary and the book Mary are separated by a gap that the public has spent almost a century not noticing, the gap between a woman who died in 1928 and a character who began to exist in print in 1932. Not a scandal, not a betrayal. Laura did not write the books while Mary was alive, and Mary did not live to read them. These are facts. But the facts, taken together, produce a strange and unsettling truth. The Mary America loves is a Mary the real Mary never met. The Mary America loves is, in a sense, Laura's Mary. A Mary constructed out of Laura's memory, Laura's needs, Laura's sense of what a children's book should be, Laura's decisions about what to include and what to leave out, Laura's affection and Laura's omissions. The Mary America loves is real, in the sense that she is built out of a real person. But she is not the same as the real person. She is a version, and the version has, for almost a century, been more present in the public mind than the person. The final cost, not the illness, not the blindness, not the 25 cents, not the 7 years at Vinton, not the fly nets, not the stroke in Keystone, not the pneumonia. The final cost is that America fell in love with a version of Mary that the real Mary never had a chance to correct, or approve, or refuse, or even read. The books are beloved. The love is real. The books are also, like every act of memory, a selection, and the selection, in Mary's case, left out the cost, left out the expense, left out the quarter in its full weight, left out the year of absence, left out the curriculum list that named the code, left out the long quiet of the adulthood after graduation, left out the fly nets, left out the stroke, left out the pneumonia, left out the 4-year gap between Mary's death and the first book. The books left out the receipt. The books kept the love. America inherited the love and forgot the receipt. This script has spent 2 hours putting the receipt back on the table. Not to cancel the love, to mature it, to let the love hold the cost, to let the readers who grew up with the Little House books grow up a little more and meet the Mary who actually lived and love her too. Love her more perhaps because she was real, and the real is always harder than the version, and the harder is always more worthy of love than the easy. The books came after, the love came after, the meaning came after. Mary was already in the ground when all of it arrived. She did not need it. She had already lived. She had already read, in her code, in her chair, in her house, in her town. She had already graduated. She had already made fly nets. She had already played the piano. She had already received Laura's letters and read them herself. She had already lived a life that the books would later make beautiful, and the beauty was real, and the life was real, and the two were not the same, and that is not a problem to be solved. It is a truth to be held. Hold it. The final echo is coming. The return to the page under her fingers, and the door America closed, and the woman who kept reading on the other side of it. The myth is not evil. That is why it survives. If the myth were only false, it would be easy to dismiss. But the Little House myth contains real tenderness, real courage, real work, real hunger, real sisterly devotion, real music in dark rooms, real family love. People do not love these stories because they are stupid. They love them because the stories carry something people need. Home, endurance, belonging. The idea that a family can face hard weather together and not be destroyed. That need is human, but need can make readers protective. When a story comforts us, we defend it from facts that make the comfort less simple. We do not want power to be costly. We do not want poverty to be ugly. We do not want child labour to sit inside a cherished scene. We do not want a blind girl's education to depend on a code most of us cannot name. We do not want the beloved version to be incomplete. So the record has to press against the myth gently but firmly, not to break it, to test it. A myth worth keeping can survive the record. It may change shape, but it does not vanish. If Little House can only remain loved when Mary's cost is hidden, then the love is too fragile. If it can remain loved while the cost is counted, then the love has grown up. What the record asks of the audience. Let the story grow up. Let the Prairie have expenses. Let the fiddle share space with the receipt. Let the sisterly love share space with the 12-hour sewing day. Let the school be inspiring and strict. Let Mary be good and frustrated, devout and limited, educated and constrained, remembered and unheard. Let New York Point sit on the page without forcing it into a cheap symbol before the fact has done its work. The record does not destroy the myth. It disciplines it. Now the record lines up against the myth one final time. The myth says, scarlet fever. The evidence shows later, medical analysis challenged that and pointed toward brain fever, likely viral meningoencephalitis. The myth says Laura helped Mary. The evidence shows yes, and one form of that help was 12 hours of sewing for 25 cents. The myth says Mary went to college for the blind. The evidence shows yes, and the curriculum included New York Point in a period when tactile literacy systems were still fighting for the future. The myth says Mary was sweet. The evidence shows she was also a high-achieving student, a graduate, a worker, and a woman whose adult life stayed narrow. The myth says Little House preserved her. The evidence shows yes, after she had died, through someone else's voice. The myth is not gone. It is heavier now. The title is heavier now. At the start, Mary Ingalls learned a dead code sounded like a strange hidden fact. By the end, it means the audience has learned how to read the whole story differently. The code is not the twist. The code is the key. And once the key turns, the room does not look the same. One page Mary never read. Not because she lacked the skill, because it did not exist while she was alive. The public page. The books that made her a character arrived after her death. The fact should not be buried near the end. It is the final cold line. Mary learned to read after blindness, but she did not live long enough to read the books that would teach millions how to read her. The final reversal. The girl who lost print, then gained touch, then became literature, missed the literature. She never saw the version. She never heard children ask about her. She never watched readers cry over her sacrifices. She never watched television give her a husband. She never watched historians debate the diagnosis. She never watched people discover New York Point and realize the blind school story was stranger than they thought. She lived before the audience. Then the audience lived with a version of her. The gap between those two facts is where the ending lives. Keep it cold. Let it be cold. The public page arrived too late for Mary Ingalls to turn it over in her own hands. The sentence brings the code, the books, and the death together without forcing them. It also returns to the physical image of touch, a page turned by hand, a woman who had learned to read by touch, a public story she never touched. After that, no new facts are needed. The final movement gathers instead of expanding. Public page to private life, myth to record, unread page to pressure marks. Mary's grave into Smet is not the ending by itself. Graves are easy endings, too easy. A grave tells us where the body rests, not what the story owes. The better ending is the page. The page contains both her education and her public afterlife. The raised dot page was one she could read. The printed public page was one she never saw. Between those pages sits her whole story. One page gave her back words. The other took control of her image, not a neat moral, a historical pressure point. Laura's public page did not steal Mary in a cruel sense. It preserved her. But preservation is never neutral. To preserve is to choose the container. Mary's container became Laura's memory, children's literature, television adaptation, and public nostalgia. Now the container must be opened, not smashed. Opened. Inside is a woman whose life does not fit the soft outline. A first daughter, a sick child, a blind student, a reader of tactile code, a graduate, a worker, a church member, a sister, a daughter, a woman who never married, a woman who did not become the fictional teacher romance required, a woman whose name remains familiar while her actual education remains obscure. The last return is specificity. Specificity, because specificity is the opposite of erasure. Mary Ingalls' life was never only the story of a girl who went blind. Blindness was the wound, not the whole body. The whole body includes a winter birth in Wisconsin, a first daughter carrying family expectation before she could name it, an illness the public remembered too simply, a little sister reading aloud when ordinary print became inaccessible, a 12-hour workday for 25 cents, territorial help for tuition and books, a train to Vinton, a strict school, music, raised print, industrial work, a tactile code, examinations, conduct marks, a commencement, a return to Smet, fly nets, church work, rented rooms, deaths in the family, a final move to carry, a stroke, pneumonia, burial, and then books she did not live to read as public memory. The shape, not clean, not uselessly dark, human. The story America received made Mary tender. The record makes her formidable, not loud, not theatrical. Formidable in the way a person becomes when the world keeps making her life smaller and she keeps learning inside the smaller space. She lost sight. She did not lose mind. She lost ordinary print. She did not lose language. She lost the future her family may have imagined for their first daughter. She did not lose the right to be more than a lesson. What the old memory has to return to her. Not pity, precision. Keep the 25 cents small enough to hurt. Keep the 12 hours long enough to feel. Keep the illness disputed. Keep the school strict. Keep the code named. Keep the graduation earned. Keep the quiet adulthood quiet without treating it as empty. Keep the books beloved without treating them as complete, the fair bargain. If we keep only the beautiful version, Mary becomes soft enough to forget. If we keep only the darker version, we turn her into another kind of object. But if we keep the wound and the record together, something more honest appears. A girl whose education was bought in pieces, a young woman who learned to read through touch, a daughter who came home to a smaller life than her education deserved, a sister remembered by a famous voice that was not her own, a public figure who became public after she could no longer answer, and a page under her fingers that still carries the best image of her. Not waiting, not simply suffering, reading, where the story should leave her, not in the soft room memory built, not in the television marriage that never belonged to her, not as the sweet blind sister whose purpose was to make other people kinder. Leave her at the page, fingers moving slowly, dots rising under the skin, a woman not borrowing someone else's eyes in that moment, a woman reading for herself. Mary Ingalls learned to read the world again. The world never learned to read her back. The real wound. And once you know how much it cost, the old story cannot go back to being simple.